He was a man who had entirely given up on the world, rotting away in a drafty, dying estate. She was a desperate woman with muddy boots, nowhere to go, and half a stolen cabbage in her satchel. When she stood in his neglected kitchen and offered to make it a home, he laughed until his chest ached. It was a cruel, hollow sound. But that was before he tasted the stew. A single, steaming bowl of broth that forced a dead man to remember what it felt like to be alive. The rain didn't fall. It spat. It drove sideways across the moors, carrying the bitter chill of late November, turning the roads into thick, sucking trenches of mud. Beatrice Kent dragged her feet through it. Her hem was ruined. Her boots were ruined. Her life, for all intents and purposes, was ruined. But she kept walking. Ahead, looming like a rotted tooth against the bruised sky, was Harrowgate. It was a sprawling stone monstrosity. Once the proud seat of the Dukes of Ashbourne, it now looked entirely abandoned. Half the windows on the east wing were boarded up. The ivy crawling up the stonework had died, clinging to the walls like blackened veins. Beatrice didn't care. It had a roof. It had walls. Right now, that was the only currency that mattered. She bypassed the main entrance. People like her, women with no chaperone, no carriage and no coin, did not knock on front doors. She slipped around the side, fighting through overgrown briars that tore at her wet wool coat, and found the servants' entrance. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. She pushed her way inside. The air in the scullery was dead. It smelled of dust, old ash, and neglect. Beatrice leaned against the stone wall, chest heaving, water pooling around her boots. She was freezing. Her fingers were numb, white at the knuckles where she gripped her small leather satchel. She needed a fire. She walked past empty pantries and unlit hearths. The kitchen was massive, built to feed 100 people, but it felt like a tomb. Copper pots hung from the ceiling, dull and tarnished. A single pathetic fire smoldered in the massive hearth, fighting a losing battle against the damp draft coming down the chimney. Beatrice dropped her satchel on a heavy wooden prep table. She was alone, or so she thought. If you're here to steal the silver, you're about 4 years too late. The voice was a low, dry rasp. It came from the shadows near the back stairwell. Beatrice jumped, spinning around, her hand instinctively dropping to the small paring knife she kept in her pocket. A man stepped into the dim light of the dying fire. He was tall. That was the first thing she noticed. The second was the sheer state of disrepair he was in. He wore a linen shirt that might have been crisp a week ago, now unbuttoned at the collar and rumpled. His dark hair was overgrown, falling into eyes the color of chipped flint. He held a half-empty bottle of cheap brandy in one hand. He looked like a vagrant, but the cut of his trousers and the heavy gold signet ring on his finger betrayed him. This was Arthur Pendleton, the Duke of Ashbourne, the man the village whispered about, the recluse, the drunk, the madman who let his inheritance turn to dust. "I have no interest in your silver," Beatrice said. Her voice shook, just a fraction, but she locked her jaw to stop it. "I only wanted shelter from the rain." Arthur took a slow drag from the bottle. He watched her. His gaze was heavy, indifferent, scraping over her muddy dress, her soaked hair, the desperate tension in her shoulders. "The local inn is 3 miles down the road," he said. "I have no money for the inn." "Then you have a problem." He turned, as if to walk away, completely unbothered by the fact that a soaked woman was standing in his kitchen. "Wait," Beatrice took a step forward. The mud on her boots squelched against the flagstones. "You have no servants. The house is empty." Arthur paused. He looked back over his shoulder. Astute observation. "I sacked them. They were noisy. They wanted to be paid. It was a tedious arrangement. You have to eat. You have to live. I manage." He lifted the brandy bottle. "You're starving," Beatrice said flatly. It wasn't an insult. It was a fact. His cheekbones were sharp enough to cut glass. His clothes hung off his frame. "And you're freezing. This house is dying." Arthur turned fully now. A muscle feathered in his jaw. The indifference in his eyes sharpened into something cold and dangerous. "And you, a stray dog dragged in from the mud, are going to point this out to me? Get out of my house! Let me stay." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. They were pathetic, begging words, but she stripped the pleading tone from them. She stood tall. She looked him dead in the eye. "Let me stay," she repeated, her voice steady. "Give me a bed and a fire. In return, I will work. I will clean. I will cook. You are living like a rat in a cellar. Let me stay, and I will make this a home." For a long moment, the kitchen was dead silent. The only sound was the rain lashing against the glass. Then Arthur Pendleton laughed. It started low in his chest, a harsh, grating sound, and erupted into a loud, barking laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. It was a terrible sound. There was no joy in it. It was the laugh of a man who found the sheer absurdity of hope deeply offensive. "A home," he choked out, wiping a hand across his mouth. "You look at this ruin, you look at me, and you think of a home. You're either blind, mad, or stupid." "I am hungry," Beatrice countered, unblinking, "and I am cold, and so are you." Arthur's laughter died. He stared at her, breathing heavily, the alcohol and the bitter amusement souring in his veins. He looked at her satchel. He looked at her determined, stubborn chin. He should throw her out. He should physically drag her to the door and lock it. Instead, he set the bottle down on a nearby barrel with a heavy thud. "There is a cot in the servants' quarters above the stables," he said, his voice stripped of all emotion. "It leaks, but it has a door. You will find nothing in the pantries but root rot and salted beef that tastes like boot leather. If you think you can make a home out of that, you are welcome to try. But do not bother me, and do not speak to me." He didn't wait for her to answer. He turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the cavernous, dark belly of the house. Beatrice stood alone in the kitchen. She looked at the dying fire. She let out a long, shaky breath, her knees finally trembling. She had a roof. She walked over to the hearth, grabbed an iron poker, and began to stoke the embers. Morning at Harrogate didn't break. It simply seeped through the dirty windows in shades of grey. Beatrice had slept in her clothes. The cot in the stable loft was exactly as Arthur had described, drafty, damp, and uncomfortable. But she had wrapped herself in a moth-eaten wool blanket she found in a trunk and slept the heavy, dreamless sleep of the utterly exhausted. When she woke, the cold was biting. She didn't linger in bed. There was no time for self-pity. Survival required momentum. She washed her face with freezing water from a rusted pump outside, tied her tangled brown hair back with a piece of string, and walked into the manor. The kitchen was colder than it had been the night before. Beatrice stripped off her coat and rolled up her sleeves. First the fire. She found a pile of damp wood near the back door. It took her 20 minutes, a lot of blowing, and a few muttered curses. But eventually, she coaxed a respectable blaze to life in the massive hearth. The heat hit her face, a small, tangible victory. Next, the inventory. Arthur had not lied. The pantries were a graveyard of culinary ambition. She found 3 barrels of flour, 2 of them infested with weevils. She found a sack of potatoes, half of them sprouted and soft. There were a few withered carrots, a pungent onion, and a small block of salt wrapped in brown paper. And then there was the meat. Hanging from a hook in the coldest part of the larder was a slab of salted beef. It was dark, hard as mahogany, and looked entirely inedible. Beatrice stared at it. She reached out and knocked on it with her knuckles. It made a solid, hollow sound. "Right," she murmured to the empty room. "We'll see about you." She dragged a heavy wooden block to the center of the kitchen. She found a cleaver that was more rust than steel. She spent 10 minutes sharpening it on a stone until it had a passable edge. Then, she took down the beef. It was exhausting work. The meat fought her at every turn. She had to throw her entire body weight behind the cleaver, hacking away the outer layer of crystallized salt and gristle until she reached the slightly softer meat underneath. She cut it into small, uniform cubes. Her shoulders burned. Her hands cramped. She dumped the meat into a large iron pot, filled it with water from the pump, and set it over the fire. She let it boil. She dumped the salty water, refilled it, and boiled it again. She did this 3 times to draw out the brine that would have otherwise turned the meal into poison. While the meat boiled, she salvaged the vegetables. She carved away the rot from the potatoes, diced the carrots, and sliced the onion. She found her satchel, opening it to reveal her prize. Half a head of cabbage, slightly bruised but crisp, stolen from a farmer's cart 2 days ago. She shredded it meticulously. Upstairs in his study, Arthur was awake. He had not slept. He had spent the night in a leather wingback chair, staring at the embers in his own fireplace, nursing the dregs of his brandy. He felt hollowed out, an empty shell of a man waiting for the structure to finally collapse. Then he smelled it. It was faint at first. It crept up the grand staircase, slipped under the heavy oak door of his study, and wound its way into his senses. Onion, browning in fat. Arthur closed his eyes. His stomach gave a violent, painful twist. He had been surviving on dry biscuits and liquor for weeks. The smell of actual cooking felt like a physical assault. It was intrusive. It demanded a response. He stood up, his joints popping, and walked out into the corridor. He didn't mean to go down. He told himself he was just going to check if the madwoman had burned the place to the ground. But his feet carried him toward the servants' stairs. He stopped on the bottom landing, staying in the shadows. He watched her. She was covered in flour and soot. Her face was flushed from the heat of the fire. She was moving with a frantic, focused energy, stirring the massive iron pot hanging over the flames. She wasn't delicate. There was nothing refined about the way she worked. She wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of a dirty wrist. She scraped the cutting board with the side of a rusted knife. Arthur watched her drop the vegetables into the pot. He listened to the hiss and sizzle as they hit the hot liquid. He hated her in that moment. He hated her because she was trying. Harrogate was a monument to his failure, a physical manifestation of his ruined life. And this woman was standing in the middle of it, stubbornly refusing to let it die. She was fighting the decay with potatoes and salt. It was pathetic. It was infuriating. But the smell, God, the smell, the sharp sting of the onion mellowed into a deep, savory richness as the beef fat rendered down. The earthy scent of root vegetables mingled with the faint hint of a dried thyme sprig she must have scavenged from the overgrown herb garden outside. It smelled like warmth. It smelled like the past before everything had gone black. Arthur realized he was gripping the wooden banister so hard his knuckles were white. He turned around, silently walking back up the stairs. He wouldn't eat it. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Down in the kitchen, Beatrice covered the pot with a heavy lid. She stepped back, her back aching, her hands blistered. The fire crackled, the pot bubbled. Now they waited. By late afternoon, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a heavier, damp fog that pressed against the windows. In the kitchen, the air was thick and heavy with the smell of the stew. It had simmered for 6 hours. The tough, leathery beef had surrendered to the low heat, breaking down into tender shreds. The potatoes had dissolved slightly, thickening the broth into a rich, glossy gravy. Beatrice took a wooden spoon, dipped it into the pot, and blew on it. She tasted it. She closed her eyes. It wasn't a masterpiece. It lacked pepper, it lacked fresh butter, and it lacked a good wine to deglaze the pot. But it was hot. It was rich. It tasted of survival. It tasted deeply, fundamentally real. She found a heavy ceramic bowl in the cupboards. She wiped the dust out of it with a cloth and ladled the stew into it. The broth was a dark mahogany, dotted with the pale yellow of potatoes and the orange flecks of carrot. The steam rose in thick, aromatic plumes. She walked out of the kitchen. She found Arthur in the dilapidated dining room. The room was massive, dominated by a long mahogany table that could seat 30. Arthur sat at the very end of it, dwarfed by the empty chairs, staring out the window at the grey fog. He looked up when she entered. His expression was a mask of cold indifference. "I told you not to bother me," he said. Beatrice ignored him. She walked the length of the table, her boots clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She stopped next to his chair and set the bowl down in front of him. She placed a dull silver spoon beside it. "Eat," she said. Arthur looked at the bowl. The steam curled around his face. His stomach clenched so hard it physically ached, but he kept his face impassive. "I didn't ask for this." "I don't care," Beatrice replied, crossing her arms. She stood there, unmoving, casting a shadow over him. "You let me stay. This is my payment." "You will eat it." Arthur scoffed, a dry, bitter sound. "You think you can come in here, boil some rotten vegetables, and play savior? You think this changes anything?" "I don't think it changes the world," Beatrice said, her voice dropping, losing its sharp edge. She sounded tired. "I think it changes the fact that you haven't eaten a hot meal in a month. I think it stops you from freezing from the inside out. Eat the stew, Your Grace. If it poisons you, you won't have to look at me anymore." Arthur's eyes snapped up to hers. She didn't flinch. She wasn't intimidated by his title, his anger, or his ruin. She was just a woman who had spent 6 hours fighting an iron pot, and she wasn't leaving until he ate. Slowly, deliberately, to show her how little he cared, Arthur picked up the spoon. He looked down at the dark broth. He expected slop. He expected the bitter, salty taste of ruined meat and burnt flour. He scooped up a small amount, a piece of beef, a fragment of potato, a pool of dark gravy, and brought it to his mouth. He swallowed. Arthur froze. He stopped breathing for a second. The spoon hovered halfway between his mouth and the bowl. It wasn't magic. It didn't instantly cure his depression or erase the years of grief. But it was good. It was incredibly, violently good. The meat melted on his tongue, savory and deep. The broth coated his throat, leaving a trail of intense, comforting heat that pooled in his hollow stomach. It tasted of salt and earth and time. It tasted like someone gave a damn. A sudden, sharp sting hit the back of his eyes. He blinked it away instantly, a surge of panic tightening his chest. He couldn't remember the last time he felt warm. He couldn't remember the last time something hadn't tasted of ash or alcohol. He lowered the spoon back into the bowl. He stared at the dark liquid, his mind racing, trying to rebuild the walls of cynicism that a single bite of beef had just kicked a hole through. Beatrice watched him. She saw the slight tremble in his hand before he gripped the spoon tighter. Saw the way his shoulders, tight up by his ears, fractionally dropped. She didn't say a word. She didn't gloat. Arthur took another bite. Then another. He didn't look up. He ate methodically, mechanically at first, and then with a quiet, desperate intensity. The bowl was empty in less than 3 minutes. The spoon scraped against the ceramic, a loud sound in the quiet room. He set the spoon down. He stared at the empty bowl. The silence stretched. It was heavy, but the hostility had bled out of it. Arthur finally looked up. He didn't say thank you. The words wouldn't fit in his mouth. But he looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the flower on her cheek and the burn on her wrist. "There is," he started, his voice a little hoarse. He cleared his throat. "There is a bedroom in the west wing. The roof doesn't leak. The fireplace draws well. You can move your things from the stable." Beatrice held his gaze. A small, tired, genuine smile touched the corners of her mouth. "I'll need wood," she said simply. Arthur looked back down at the empty bowl. "I'll chop it." The axe was dull. Its handle was splintered. The iron head rusted brown and heavy. Arthur gripped it anyway. He stood in the courtyard behind the kitchens, the morning frost biting at his face. The air was thin and sharp. He threw his coat over a broken stone bench and rolled up the sleeves of his linen shirt. His breath plumed white in the grey air. At his feet lay the remains of a massive, fallen oak that a storm had brought down 2 winters ago. It had been rotting in the mud ever since. He swung the axe. It hit the wood with a dull, ineffective thud, biting barely a 1/4 inch into the bark. The shock traveled up the wooden handle, rattling the bones in Arthur's forearms and jarring his shoulders. He hissed through his teeth. His muscles, atrophied by months of sitting in a chair and drowning himself in cheap spirits, screamed in immediate protest. He swung again, harder this time. The blade caught. For the next 2 hours, Arthur Pendleton waged a bitter, violent war against the dead tree. He did not know how to chop wood. He was a duke. Before the collapse of his life, a dozen men would have ensured a roaring fire in every room he graced before he even woke. Now, he was just a man with a piece of iron, fighting to keep a promise he didn't fully understand why he'd made. Blisters formed on his palms within the first 20 minutes. By the hour mark, they had popped, leaving raw, weeping skin pressed against the rough grain of the axe handle. He ignored the sting. There was something profoundly grounding about the pain. It drowned out the noise in his head. Every swing, every splintering crack of wood was a second he wasn't thinking about the empty halls of Harrowgate, the mounting debts, or the suffocating guilt that usually paralyzed him. He chopped until his shoulders burned with a fierce, lactic fire. He chopped until he was sweating through his shirt despite the freezing temperature. Inside the house, Beatrice was fighting her own war. The West Wing bedroom was, as Arthur had promised, dry. But it had not been touched in perhaps a decade. Dust lay thick on the floorboards, looking like a blanket of grey snow. The heavy velvet curtains were stiff with age, the mattress on the massive mahogany bed smelling of old lavender and stale air. Beatrice tied a rag over her nose and mouth and set to work. She hauled buckets of freezing water up 2 flights of stairs. Her hips ached from the heavy lifting, her boots slipping on the worn wooden treads. She stripped the bed. She threw the heavy, dusty rugs out the window, letting them crash into the courtyard below, where she would beat them clean later. She got down on her hands and knees and scrubbed the floorboards with a stiff brush and a sliver of lye soap she had found in the scullery. The lye ate at the skin of her hands. The icy water numbed her fingers until they were stiff claws. She didn't stop. She moved with a desperate, frantic rhythm. If she stopped, she would realize how cold she was. If she stopped, she would remember that she was entirely dependent on a volatile, broken man in a dying estate. By mid-afternoon, the room was clean. The wood floors gleamed dully. The mattress was turned. The curtains were beaten free of dust and tied back to let in the pale, watery sunlight. Beatrice sat back on her heels, wiping her brow with the back of a raw, red hand. She took a deep breath. It smelled like soap and cold air. It smelled clean. A heavy, dragging footstep sounded in the hallway. Beatrice turned. Arthur stood in the doorway. He looked terrible. His shirt was clinging to him with sweat. His hair was plastered to his forehead. His breathing was ragged, shallow, and harsh in the quiet room. In his arms he held a massive pile of split oak. It was roughly chopped, the cuts uneven and jagged, but it was dry. He walked past her without a word. He crossed to the grand stone fireplace, dropped the wood onto the hearth with a deafening clatter, and stepped back. He swayed, just slightly, his boots scuffing the clean floorboards. Beatrice stood up. She looked at the wood. Then she looked at his hands. He had tried to wipe the blood off on his trousers, but it was still seeping from his torn palms, staining the white linen of his cuffs. His knuckles were bruised, the skin shredded. Arthur caught her looking. He immediately curled his hands into fists, hiding the damage, a flash of defensive pride hardening his features. He lifted his chin, his jaw setting into a rigid line. "The chimney is clear," he said roughly. "I checked it from the roof. It will draw." Beatrice looked from his bleeding hands to his sweat-streaked face. She didn't offer pity. She knew instinctively that pity would be the one thing that would make him turn on his heel and leave. She stepped forward. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a clean, torn strip of linen she had salvaged from a ruined sheet to use as a dusting rag. She held it out to him. "Wrap them," she said simply, "or you'll get an infection from the bark, and I won't have time to nurse you. I have dinner to make." Arthur stared at the white cloth. He looked at her face, searching for mockery, searching for the cloying sympathy he despised. He found neither. He found only the weary, practical gaze of a woman who understood exactly what it cost to survive the day. Slowly, his jaw unclenching, he reached out and took the cloth. His fingers brushed hers. They were ice cold. "Thank you," he muttered, the words barely audible. "Thank you for the wood," she replied. He turned and walked out. Beatrice knelt by the hearth. She built a teepee of kindling, struck a flint, and watched as the small flame caught. The fire grew, greedy and bright, pushing back the damp chill of the room. For the first time in months, Beatrice felt warm. The stew lasted 3 days. On the 4th morning, Beatrice scraped the bottom of the iron pot, finding nothing but hardened grease. She washed her hands, dried them on her apron, and walked to the study. Arthur was sitting in the leather wingback chair. He wasn't drinking. The brandy bottle on the side table was completely empty, and he was staring at it with a tight, drawn expression that spoke of a deep, physical craving. His hands, wrapped in dirty linen, were resting on the armrests. He was shaking slightly. Beatrice didn't knock. She stepped into the room, bringing the cold air of the hallway with her. "We are out of food," she said. Arthur didn't look up. "There are potatoes. The potatoes are rot. We need flour. We need butter. We need meat that doesn't require a hammer to eat. We need salt." Arthur closed his eyes. The tremor in his left hand worsened. "I have no coin." "You have an estate," Beatrice countered flatly. "You have silver. You have art. Everything of value was sold 2 years ago," he snapped, his voice a sudden, sharp whip-crack of anger. He finally looked at her, his eyes hollow and furious. "The silver is gone. The paintings are gone. The horses are gone. Do you think I sit here in the cold for the sheer aesthetic pleasure of it? Harrogate is bankrupt. I am bankrupt." Beatrice didn't flinch. She had grown up avoiding the fists of drunkards and the sharp knives of debt collectors. Arthur's temper was a tired, blunt thing compared to what she had survived. "Then find something," she said quietly. "Or we starve by Thursday." She turned and left him. She went back to the kitchen and began scrubbing the wooden tables with sand, waiting. An hour later, Arthur appeared in the doorway. He wore a heavy wool overcoat, its lapels worn thin, his boots pulled over his trousers. In his bandaged hand, he held a small leather pouch. It clinked softly as he shifted his weight. "Get your coat," he said, staring at the floor. The walk to the village of Oakhaven took nearly an hour. The road was a rutted mess of frozen mud and deep puddles. They walked in silence, keeping a foot of space between them. The wind whipped across the open moors, biting through Beatrice's thin wool coat. Arthur kept his head down, the collar of his coat turned up against the cold. Oakhaven was a small, tight-knit village. It smelled of coal smoke and wet sheep. As they walked down the main thoroughfare, the effect was immediate. Conversations stopped. Women scrubbing steps paused, brushes hovering in mid-air. A blacksmith's hammer ceased its ringing strike. Eyes tracked them. The Mad Duke had come down from his rotting hill. And he had a woman with him. Arthur's posture changed instantly. He went completely rigid. His shoulders drew up, his jaw clenching so tight Beatrice could see the muscle jumping under his skin. He stopped walking with a heavy, dragging step, and instead moved with a stiff, unnatural haughtiness. He was putting on his armor. He looked straight ahead, ignoring the stairs, his face a mask of supreme, aristocratic indifference. But Beatrice saw the sweat bead on his temple. She saw his bandaged hands curl into tight fists inside his pockets. He was terrified. He was a man flayed open, marching through a gauntlet of people who had watched his father rule and now watched him ruin. They reached the butcher's shop. A bell chimed as Arthur pushed the heavy door open. The smell of raw meat, sawdust, and dried blood hit them. Behind the heavy wooden counter stood Thomas, a massive man with a stained apron and a cleaver in his hand. Thomas looked up. His eyes widened. He wiped his hands on a rag, his expression hardening into a guarded, unfriendly mask. "Your Grace," Thomas said. His tone was perfectly polite and entirely devoid of respect. "We haven't seen you in the village for some time. I require supplies," Arthur said. His voice was clipped, cold, entirely different from the rough rasp Beatrice had grown used to. It was the voice of a man who owned the land they stood on, even if it was rotting beneath his feet. "Is that so?" Thomas leaned heavy on the counter. "I recall the last time supplies went up to Harrogate. The bill went unpaid for 6 months. Arthur flinched. It was microscopic, a tiny tightening of the eyes. But Beatrice saw it. The silence in the shop grew heavy, thick with the old resentments of a village that had been dragged down by its lord's neglect. Arthur reached into his pocket. He pulled out the leather pouch and untied the strings with clumsy, bandaged fingers. He tipped it over the counter. A heavy, solid gold pocket watch slid onto the wood. It was beautifully chased, the crest of the Ashbourne family deeply engraved on the front. Beatrice sucked in a quiet breath. That wasn't a trinket. That was a piece of him. Thomas stared at the watch. He didn't touch it. He looked up at Arthur, a sneer pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Pawning your father's timepiece for a side of beef, Your Grace?" How far the mighty fall? Arthur went pale. His hand hovered over the watch, shaking. He looked like he was going to be sick. He'd opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The crushing weight of his shame had pinned him to the floorboards. Beatrice stepped forward. She moved so smoothly she was at the counter before Thomas could react. She slammed her hand down flat on the wood, covering the gold watch entirely. "We are not pawning anything," Beatrice said. Her voice was sharp, loud, and rang off the tiled walls. She fixed Thomas with a glare that could have stripped paint from a hull. "We are purchasing, and we are paying in gold, because paper notes are entirely useless to men who don't know how to run a proper ledger." Thomas blinked, taken aback by the sudden fury of this dirty, ragged woman. "Who are you?" "I am the housekeeper of Harrogate," Beatrice lied without missing a beat, her chin jutting out. and the Duke has grown tired of his meals tasting of poor quality. I need a whole chicken, a ham hock, 4 pounds of your best bacon, a sack of flour, and 3 pounds of salt. Now." Thomas scowled. "Listen here, girl." "No, you listen." Beatrice cut him off, leaning over the counter. "That watch is worth 20 times what this miserable shop turns over in a year. You will weigh it. You will cut us a fair price for the meat, and you will give us the change in silver shillings. If you attempt to shortchange His Grace, I will personally walk this watch to the jeweler in York and tell every soul on the road that Thomas the Butcher is a cheat who turns away honest gold. Do we understand each other?" The shop was dead silent. Arthur was staring at Beatrice, his breath caught in his throat. He had never seen someone defend him. He had spent years defending himself against the whispers, against the pity, against the rage. But this woman, who owed him nothing, had just thrown herself between him and the village's disdain like a shield. Thomas looked from Beatrice to the grim, shocked face of the Duke. He grumbled, spitting into the sawdust on the floor. "Fine," Thomas muttered, pulling out his ledger. "Let me see the watch." Beatrice lifted her hand. The transaction was tense, brisk, and fiercely negotiated by Beatrice, who haggled over the price of the bacon with the viciousness of a street dog defending a bone. Arthur stood behind her, silent. The rigid tension in his spine had slowly uncoiled. 20 minutes later, they walked out of the shop. Arthur carried a heavy sack over his shoulder. Beatrice carried a woven basket filled with wrapped meat and a dozen fresh eggs. In Arthur's pocket, heavy and solid, sat 20 silver shillings. They walked back down the road, leaving the village behind. The wind was still biting, the road still muddy, but the walk felt entirely different. When they reached the iron gates of the estate, Arthur finally stopped. He hoisted the heavy sack higher onto his shoulder. He looked down at Beatrice. Her nose was red from the cold, her hair blowing wildly in the wind. "You did not have to do that," Arthur said. His voice was low. It wasn't the Duke speaking. It was just a man. Beatrice adjusted her grip on the basket. She didn't look at him, keeping her eyes on the path ahead. "A man shouldn't be made to bleed in public," she said quietly. "The world is hard enough. We have food now. Let's go home." Arthur stared at her profile. For the first time in years, the word didn't sound like a lie. "Home." "Yes," he said, following her up the path. "Let's go." The kitchen of Harrogate felt entirely different that evening. It was no longer a tomb. The massive hearth blazed, casting a warm orange glow across the stone walls and the newly scrubbed flagstones. The scent of roasting chicken filled the air, a heavy, intoxicating perfume of melted butter, sage, and crispy skin. Beatrice was at the wooden table, her sleeves rolled up, working flour and butter into a pastry crust. She moved with practiced, efficient grace, the flour dusting her forearms like snow. Arthur sat at a small wooden stool near the fire. He was peeling potatoes. It was a staggering sight. The Duke of Ashbourne, a man who once dined with royalty, was hunched over a tin bucket, meticulously shaving the skins off dirty root vegetables with a paring knife. He moved slowly, his bandaged hands clumsy. But he didn't stop. He hadn't asked if he could help. He had simply picked up the knife and sat down, silence stretched between them. But it had changed. The prickly, hostile quiet of the first few days had dissolved. This silence was companionable. It was the hum of shared work. "You cut the skins too thick," Beatrice observed, not looking up from her dough. "You're losing half the potato." Arthur paused. He looked down at the pale, angular lump in his hand, then at the thick ribbon of skin in the bucket. "I am unaccustomed to the geometry of vegetables, clearly." She rolled out the dough with a heavy wooden pin. "Use a lighter touch. Let the blade do the work. Don't force it." Arthur adjusted his grip. He tried again. The skin came off in a thinner strip. "Like this?" Better. He dropped the peeled potato into a bowl of clean water. He watched her for a moment. The firelight caught the dust of flour on her cheek. "Where did you learn to bargain with butchers?" he asked. Beatrice didn't stop rolling the dough, but her shoulders stiffened slightly. It was the first time he had asked a question about her. Real, unforced curiosity. "Cheapside," she said, keeping her voice even. "London. The markets there are not for the gentle. If you show a copper coin and hesitate, you lose the coin, the bread, and possibly a finger." "You lived in London?" "I survived in London," she corrected. She lifted the dough, draped it over a tin pie dish, and began crimping the edges. "My father was a watchmaker, not a grand one. He fixed the cogs of working men. When he died, the landlord took his tools for back rent. The streets took the rest." Arthur stopped peeling. He stared at the fire, watching the flames lick around the heavy iron spit where the chicken turned, dripping fat onto the hot coals. He understood the brutality of sudden loss, even if the scale was vastly different. "And how did you end up in Yorkshire, dragging yourself through the mud to a ruined estate?" he asked gently. It wasn't an interrogation. He simply wanted to know. Beatrice sighed. She wiped her hands on her apron and leaned against the table, looking at him. "I found a position as a scullery maid in a manor near York. I worked there for 3 years. She looked down at her hands, tracing the lines of flour on her knuckles. "The master of the house had a son. He returned from university. He was accustomed to taking what he wanted. Wine, horses, women. When I refused him, he didn't take it well. He broke 3 of my ribs. When I complained to the housekeeper, she called me a liar and threw me out in the night. No wages, no coat." Arthur's grip on the paring knife tightened until his knuckles went white beneath the bandages. A dark, ugly rage flared in his chest, a sudden, violent protectiveness that shocked him with its intensity. He looked at her slender frame, imagining the bruising, the cold, the sheer terror of being discarded into the night. "I should like to know his name," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a deadly quiet register. Beatrice looked up, surprised by the venom in his tone. She offered a small, sad smile. "His name doesn't matter. He has a warm bed and a full belly. The world is built for men like him." "The world is a broken mechanism," Arthur muttered, looking back at the fire. "It rewards the cruel and punishes the honest." "Is that why you stopped trying?" she asked. The question hung in the air, blunt and heavy. Beatrice held her breath. She had pushed too far. She expected him to stand up, throw the knife down, and walk out. She expected the Duke to return, cold and untouchable. Instead, Arthur let out a long, ragged exhale. The fight seemed to drain out of him, leaving him looking very tired and very young. "I didn't stop trying because the world was cruel," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the flames. "I stopped trying because I was the one who broke it." Beatrice didn't move. She waited. "My father left me a prosperous estate," Arthur continued, the words coming out in a slow, painful trickle. He had not spoken these truths aloud in 2 years. "I thought I was invincible. I invested heavily in trade ships bound for the Indies. I borrowed against the land. I borrowed against the tenant farms. I borrowed against the very stones of this house. 3 ships went down in a hurricane. The 4th was taken by privateers." He set the knife down. He looked at his hands, his bandaged, ruined hands. The debts came due all at once. Hundreds of families in Oakhaven lost their livelihoods because of my arrogance. The servants I sacked? I didn't sack them. I couldn't pay them. They left. My fiancée, the daughter of an earl, returned my ring within the month. Harrowgate didn't die of natural causes, Beatrice. I slaughtered it. The silence in the kitchen was profound. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the hiss of dripping fat. Arthur waited for her judgment. He waited for the disgust to settle on her face. He was a failure, a fool who had gambled with other people's lives and lost everything. Beatrice walked over to the fire. She knelt beside him. She reached out and took the heavy iron poker, adjusting the logs to let more air into the heart of the blaze. "You made a mistake," she said, her voice steady. "A massive, stupid, catastrophic mistake." Arthur let out a bitter half-laugh. "Your comfort is overwhelming." "I am not here to comfort you," Beatrice said, turning her head to look him in the eye. "I am here to tell you the truth. You broke it." "Fine. The ship sank. The money is gone. But the stone is still here. The land is still here. You are still breathing. You can sit in the dark and drink yourself into a shallow grave, or you can pick up a rusty axe and chop wood." She pointed to the bucket of potatoes at his feet. "You peeled the potatoes," she said simply. "It's a start." Arthur looked at the bucket. He looked at the woman kneeling beside him, smelling of flour and wood smoke. The crippling weight on his chest, the guilt that had suffocated him for years, didn't vanish. It was still there. But for the first time, it didn't feel fatal. It felt like something he might, eventually, be able to carry. "How long until the chicken is ready?" he asked softly. Beatrice smiled, a real, warm expression that reached her eyes. 10 minutes, she said. "Set the table." January came down on Yorkshire like a hammer. The moors froze solid. The wind howled through the cracked masonry of Harrowgate, and the snow piled high against the lower windows. But inside, the house was breathing. It was a shallow, ragged breath, perhaps, but it was life. Beatrice and Arthur lived entirely in the kitchen and the west wing, sealing off the rest of the massive, drafty manor to conserve heat. Their days settled into a brutal, rhythmic cadence of survival. They woke in the dark. They broke the ice in the wash basins. They hauled wood. They boiled water. They kept the fires burning. Arthur changed. The gaunt, hollow-eyed ghost who had haunted the corridors weeks ago slowly faded. In his place stood a man forged by necessity. He chopped wood until his shoulders broadened and his calluses grew thick. When the meat ran low, he took an old, rusted fowling piece from the armory and spent hours in the freezing woods, coming back with rabbits and pheasants. He stopped drinking entirely. The withdrawal had been a quiet, violent agony, played out in the dark of his study. Beatrice had left him alone during it, leaving only a pitcher of clean water and a damp cloth by his door. When he finally emerged, pale and shaking, neither of them spoke of it. They just went back to work. One evening in late February, the wind was screaming against the glass. The kitchen was suffocatingly warm, smelling of wood smoke and the faint, sweet scent of the dried apples Beatrice was simmering on the stove. Arthur was sitting at the heavy wooden table, hunched over a piece of harness leather he was trying to mend with a thick needle. His brow was furrowed in concentration. Beatrice was sitting across from him, mending a tear in the sleeve of his only good wool coat. The silence between them had become a physical thing. It wasn't empty. It was dense, heavy with the weight of things unsaid. They moved around each other in the small space with an unspoken choreography. They knew exactly how the other took their tea. They knew the sound of each other's footsteps on the stairs. "You're pulling the thread too tight," Beatrice said softly, not looking up from her stitching. "The leather will bunch." Arthur stopped. He looked at the mangled seam in his hands, then up at her. The firelight caught the stray strands of brown hair escaping from her bun. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her hands were permanently red from the lye soap. Yet, to him, She had become the center of gravity in a world that had spent 2 years spinning out of control. "I lack your precision," he murmured, setting the leather down. He leaned back, stretching his stiffer shoulders. "I went to Oakhaven today." Beatrice's needle paused. She looked up. "To the butcher?" "To the baker. His roof collapsed under the snow last week." Arthur ran a hand over his face. "I helped him clear the timber. I told him I would send a cart of slate from the old quarry on the estate to patch it in the spring." "I told him the estate would cover the cost." Beatrice stared at him. She knew exactly what that meant. For 2 years, the Duke of Ashbourne had hidden from his tenants, too ashamed to look them in the eye, too broke to fulfill his duties as their lord. "What did he say?" she asked. Arthur looked down at his scarred hands. "He spit on the ground. He told me the slate would probably be rotten." A small, wry smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Then he gave me a loaf of bread and told me not to be late with the cart." "It is a start." "It is," she agreed softly. Arthur reached across the table. He didn't ask for permission. He simply laid his hand over hers, trapping the needle and the wool beneath his palm. His skin was rough, warm, and heavy. Beatrice's breath hitched. She went perfectly still. "You saved my life, Beatrice," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper, raw and entirely stripped of pretense. "I was a dead man sitting in a chair. You kicked the door down and dragged me back." Beatrice looked at his hand, large and capable, covering her own scarred, tired fingers. A sudden, fierce ache bloomed in her chest. She had spent her whole life fighting to be invisible, fighting to survive in the margins of a world that didn't want her. No one had ever looked at her the way Arthur was looking at her now, as if she were the only thing keeping the roof from caving in. She turned her hand over beneath his. She laced her fingers through his. "You chopped the wood, Arthur," she whispered back. "I only lit the match." He squeezed her hand, a desperate, anchoring grip. They sat there as the wind battered the old house, 2 ruined people holding on to each other in the dark. The thaw arrived in March, turning the estate into a sprawling sea of mud. The snow melted, revealing the full extent of the rot in the gardens, the collapsed stone walls, and the sheer volume of work that lay ahead. It also revealed the road to London. Beatrice was on her hands and knees in the courtyard, tearing out thick, dead briars from the old kitchen garden when she heard the sound. The heavy, rhythmic thud of hooves and the rattle of a well-sprung carriage. She stood up, wiping her muddy hands on her burlap apron. A sleek, black carriage with a gold crest painted on the door pulled to a stop before the main entrance. A footman in pristine livery jumped down, opening the door. Out stepped a man who looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of Harrogate. He wore a tailored charcoal topcoat, a silk cravat, and polished leather boots that immediately sank half an inch into the mud. He looked around the decaying manor with a sneer of pure, unfiltered disgust. This was Lord Charles Kenway. Arthur emerged from the stables a moment later. He was carrying a pitchfork, his shirt sleeves rolled up. Dirt smeared across his jaw. When he saw the carriage, he stopped dead. His grip on the pitchfork tightened until the wood groaned. "Arthur!" Kenway called out, his voice sharp and carrying across the courtyard. He didn't walk toward Arthur. He expected Arthur to come to him. "Good God, man. I heard the rumors, but I assumed they were exaggerated. You look like a field hand." Arthur handed the pitchfork to a bewildered stable boy they had hired 2 weeks prior. He walked slowly toward the carriage. His posture shifted, the relaxed, grounded man of the past few months instantly locking away. "Charles," Arthur said, stopping a few feet away, "to what do I owe the displeasure? You are a long way from Mayfair." "I was visiting my sister in York," Kenway said, pulling a silver cigar case from his pocket. "I thought I would survey my latest investment. I purchased the last of your promissory notes from the bank, Arthur. The debt is entirely mine now." He gestured lazily at the house. "I came to offer you a way out. Sign the estate over to me. I'll clear your name, give you a small stipend to live quietly in Scotland, and I'll tear this monstrosity down to build a proper summer home." Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. She stepped out from the shadows of the garden wall. Kenway caught the movement. His eyes snapped to her, dragging up and down her muddy dress, her apron, her unpinned hair. A slow, deeply unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Ah," Kenway drawled, his tone dripping with venomous amusement. "I see you haven't lost all your appetites, Arthur, though your standards have plummeted. Tell me, does she charge by the hour, or do you just let her sleep in the house for the novelty of it?" The silence that followed was absolute. Beatrice braced herself. She waited for Arthur to look away. She waited for the Duke to emerge, to distance himself from the dirty housekeeper, to protect whatever shred of pride he had left in front of his peer. She had seen men cave to the pressure of society 100 times before. Arthur didn't look away. He didn't flinch. He moved so fast that Kenway didn't even have time to step back. Arthur closed the distance between them, grabbed Kenway by the lapels of his expensive topcoat, and slammed him backward into the side of the carriage. The wood cracked. The horses whinnied in panic. The footman leaped forward, but froze when he saw the look in Arthur's eyes. Arthur pinned Kenway to the carriage door. He wasn't the broken drunk man who had lost his ships. He was a man who had spent the winter swinging an axe, hauling stone, and fighting the freezing earth. The muscles in his forearms were corded tight as iron. "You will not speak to her," Arthur said. His voice was completely devoid of a shout. It was a low, terrifying rasp that carried the promise of immediate violence. "You will not look at her. You will not breathe the air in her direction." Kenway's face flushed dark red, panic finally breaking through his arrogant veneer. "Take your hands off me, you madman. I own this land. I hold the notes." "You hold paper," Arthur snarled, shaking him once, hard enough to rattle Kenway's teeth. "I hold the stone. I hold the mud. You want Harrogate? You will have to drag me out of it in a pine box. Do you understand me? I am not running to Scotland. I am not hiding anymore." Arthur shoved Kenway away. The Lord stumbled, catching himself against the carriage wheel, his silk cravat skewed, his breathing heavy. "You're a fool," Kenway spat, straightening his coat with shaking hands. "You have nothing. You are nothing." Arthur turned. He looked at Beatrice standing by the garden wall. His eyes softened, just for a fraction of a second, before he looked back at the man he used to call a friend. "I have everything I require," Arthur said coldly. "Get off my land, Charles. If I see your carriage on this road again, I will burn it to the axles." Kenway scrambled into the carriage. He slammed the door, shouting at the driver. The black coach lurched forward, the wheels spinning in the mud before finding purchase and rocketing down the driveway. Arthur stood in the courtyard, chest heaving, watching the carriage disappear into the mist. He slowly uncurled his fists. His knuckles were white. Beatrice walked toward him. She stopped a foot away. Her heart was hammering violently against her ribs. Arthur finally turned to her. The anger drained from his face, leaving him looking exhausted but entirely grounded. He reached out, hesitating for a moment, before gently brushing a smear of dirt from her cheek with his thumb. "Are you all right?" he asked roughly. Beatrice swallowed hard. "You shouldn't have done that. He holds your debts. He could ruin you." "I was already ruined, Beatrice," Arthur said quietly. "Then you walked into my kitchen. Spring arrived with a desperate, beautiful violence. The grey moors turned a vivid, shocking green. The ancient apple trees in the overgrown orchard, long thought dead, exploded into pale pink blossoms. Harrogate was still a crumbling stone giant, its roof still missing slate in the east wing, its grand halls still dusty and empty. But the kitchen garden was thriving, neat rows of carrots and cabbages pushing through the dark soil. The debts remained. The threat of ruin still hung over them, heavy and real. But something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer waiting to die. They were fighting to live. It was late May, the evening air warm and smelling of damp earth. Beatrice was in the kitchen, standing by the massive prep table. She was shelling peas into a wooden bowl. She wore a simple cotton dress she had sewn herself, her hair pinned up off her neck. The back door opened, and Arthur walked in. He had spent the day working with the tenant farmers, repairing the stone walls that divided the pastures. He was covered in dust, his linen shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sweat gleaming on his throat. He looked exhausted. But there was a quiet, profound peace in his eyes that hadn't been there 6 months ago. He didn't go to the wash basin. He walked straight to the table. He stood across from Beatrice, watching her hands move efficiently over the pea pods. He set something down on the wood between them. Beatrice paused. She looked down. It was the heavy gold pocket watch, the one he had nearly pawned to the butcher in the winter. She looked up at him, confused. "Arthur, I rode into York 2 days ago," Arthur said. His voice was steady, but there was a faint tremor in his hands as he braced them on the table. "I sold the watch to a jeweler. I paid the butcher his remaining balance. I paid the baker for the slate. I paid off the 3 smallest tenant debts." Beatrice stared at the gold watch sitting on the table. "But it's right here." "I sold the casing. I sold the gold," Arthur corrected quietly. He reached out and tapped the watch. The mechanism inside, the cogs, the wheels, the gears, I kept. I put it in a cheap brass shell. It still tells time. It just doesn't look like a duke's watch anymore. It looks like a working man's. Beatrice's breath caught in her throat. She understood exactly what he was saying. The crest was gone. The title was gone. He had stripped away the gold and kept only what functioned. Arthur walked around the table. He stopped in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating off him. He reached down and took her hands, pulling them away from the wooden bowl. His calluses scraped gently against hers. "I have nothing to offer you, Beatrice," he said, his voice dropping into a fierce, quiet intensity. "The debts will take years to clear. This house will be drafty for a decade. I have no servants to draw your bath, no carriages to take you to London. I am a man who chops his own wood and peels his own potatoes." He looked down at her hands, holding them tightly against his chest, right over his heart. "But you told me you could make this a home," he whispered. "You lied. You didn't make a home. You made me a home. You are my home, Beatrice." Beatrice looked up into his eyes. The flinty, cold gaze she had met in this very room 6 months ago was entirely gone. In its place was a naked, terrifying vulnerability. He was handing her his life, entirely unvarnished. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes. She didn't wipe them away. She stepped closer, closing the final inch between them. She reached up, framing his dusty, unshaven jaw with her hands. "I don't want a carriage, Arthur," she said, her voice shaking but fiercely certain. "I don't want gold. I just want the man who stayed." Arthur let out a shaky breath, closing his eyes as he leaned his weight into her hands. Then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was the desperate, starving kiss of a man who had finally found the surface after drowning for years. It tasted of salt and sweat and survival. Beatrice kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hands tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer, anchoring him to her, to the earth, to this room. When they finally broke apart, resting their foreheads together, breathing heavily in the quiet kitchen, Arthur let out a low, rough laugh. It wasn't the hollow, cruel sound she had heard on her first night. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. He looked over her shoulder at the hearth. A heavy iron pot hung over the fire, simmering gently. "What's for dinner?" he asked, a smile pulling at his mouth. Beatrice smiled back, a radiant, beautiful thing that lit up the dim room. "Beef stew," she said softly. "But this time, we have fresh butter. A home isn't built of stone, and a man isn't defined by his title. It is built in the quiet moments of shared labor, the patching of wounds, and the stubborn refusal to let the fire die." Beatrice and Arthur didn't get a fairy tale ending with endless riches. They got something far better. They got a real, breathing life, built with their own calloused hands. If this story made you believe in the power of second chances, hit that like button and share it with someone who appreciates a love story rooted in reality. Subscribe to the channel for more deeply human historical dramas. Tell me in the comments, what is the hardest thing you've ever had to build from scratch? Until next time, keep the fire burning.